Hello everyone and welcome to this month's video, which is going to talk about volatility and risk in the agricultural landscape. I'm joined by Aled Thomas, who's Principal Analyst with the Food Retail and Manufacturing team. I'm Peter Story, Head of Prices for Food and Agricultural Commodities. So Aled, firstly, good to see you again.
And you as well, Peter.
Thank you very much. Secondly, I should say, let's talk about weather and get a bit of an update. I think last time we were speaking a couple of months ago, we were looking at the situation in Europe, especially Northern Europe, which had some pretty bad drought over the summer months. Seemed like it was historically dry for a lot of areas of the continent. Looking at news reports in the past few weeks, it certainly seems like there are some concerns, certainly in the UK where we are, that fresh produce items like your broccolis, your cauliflowers, things like that, that the yields are going to be exceptionally low due to the weather that we've been seeing. So is this very much a wider trend within both the UK and the wider continent, not just for fresh produce, but also any real crops?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that is quite important when it comes to things like fresh produce as well is we consider obviously yield, but it's actually the marketable yield that retailers and consumers want to buy. Because of course, you could have a very big cauliflower, but if it doesn't look very nice, people won't buy it. And often it's kind of the high levels of sun and drought that cause them to go yellow, etc., and things like that. But this is certainly something that has been seen not only here in the UK, but also across on the continent in Europe. And it's almost been a bit of a double whammy this year because, of course, you remember, I think we did a podcast a little while ago about the frosts over in sort of Eastern Europe, which caused significant issues. And then that's been compounded then this year by droughts through the summer as well. I mean, just this morning I was looking at plums in Europe, and it looks like in places like Serbia, the plum crop is going to be about 80% lower year on year because of the frost at the start of the year, but then also the excess heat pushing the plants on through their life cycles far too quickly, which has made the crop yields really low.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to what you were saying about how obviously the consumers, have to, the crop that's produced needs to be marketable to consumers. Do you think that, consumers might just need to manage expectations that, their cauliflower might not just be that white, or do you think it's more the case that British consumers, for example, will get their cauliflowers from elsewhere for the most part this year?
Well, it's an interesting concept. I'm not sure we could do a whole podcast on that whole topic by itself. But I think consumers, not only in Britain, although I do think we're perhaps very acute to it here, but consumers across Europe have become very renowned to going to a supermarket or a food store and having this idea of plump, fresh vegetables, very good-looking vegetables. Now, of course, there is some element here of the worser-looking vegetables or the things that have been perhaps sun damage can go into processing. So it's not always saying it's going to waste. But certainly, I think there is a sense that consumers have become too acclimatized to good-looking crops and the sort of fresh vegetables. Just as for an example, here in the UK, when you plant a field of cauliflowers, for example, you only really expect to actually harvest 55% to go to market. So essentially, you're wasting 45% of every crop just purely based on how the crop is looking and nothing else. So it is an interesting concept and something that if policymakers across Europe and the UK really wanted to tackle, then we would see much higher utilisation of food in our economies, which would eventually drive food prices down.
Yeah, and if summers like we've had this year become a bit more normal, then potentially it is something that we will eventually have to just get used to.
Yeah, I suppose there's that, but there's also the expectation of seasonal produce as well. We've become very acclimatized to having whatever crop we want at any time by going into the supermarket and actually trying to force crops far too much when they're not acclimatized to it. And there's obviously certain years where it'd be easier to grow a drought-hardy crop and certain years where it's better to do a crop that's better in waterlogged conditions. But of course, the way consumer and food retail is driven at the moment is people are expecting every single type of variation of everything on the shelf at one time.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Aled. And then secondly, I wanted us to go over to the EU deforestation regulation situation. Now, the regulation, which is meant to stop companies from importing produce that's been grown on deforested land, that was meant to go into force, I think, in 2024, in December. That was then kicked back to December 2025, and now it certainly seems like we're heading towards another year-long delay to December 2026. So obviously this has really huge implications for a lot of commodities in the agricultural space within Europe and even within the EU and further afield. Things like coffee, like soybeans, and many others. So what exactly was the reason for this, and what are we expecting the implications to be?
So the reason mainly that the European Commission are saying that they're going to push it back another year, which I think is probably not a surprise to many people who've been following the EUDR regulation. But the reason they were citing was IT issues, and essentially it was around the IT system that is going to be used to track this produce and making sure that it's able to be certified through a certain pathway, and that's not quite right, and that's why they're going to push back another year, as you say, to December 2026. This was originally meant to come in December 2024, and like you said, it's a lot of agricultural commodities it's going to affect, but also it's their byproducts too. So it's a significant impact on Europe. And one thing, I was at a conference early last week in London, and it was about procurement and supply chain. And I recall talking to people there actually and saying, is this pushback going to affect the way you actually look at sustainability and how you're producing and supplying or procuring products? And the reaction was somewhat mixed, because some people will say, well, we're just going to basically follow the principle anyway because it's the right thing to do in their view, and it's more sustainable, and then they're ready for when the legislation comes in. But some people were, of course, saying they're going to wait till the exact last day that they need to introduce those kind of extra measures and checks. So the reality is this legislation has caused significant volatility in a lot of things that we are reliant on imports, things like coffee, etc., and cocoa. So it is going to keep having that volatile effect. But I also think now it's become such a expectation it's going to be delayed. The volatility of each delay is getting less and less and less. So I haven't seen major market moves so far, but of course there is time to see that change.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if it does look like, certainly by the time we get to this point next year, that everything is going to go ahead, then I suppose we could see some quite weird market dynamics where there are certain importers or traders who are buying off land that has been used for deforestation and others that haven't been. And there could be a weird sort of dynamic in the market. Maybe it might only last a certain number of months until the full legislation comes in to force. But yeah, we could see a bit of maybe not a discrepancy, but a divergence.
Yeah, I suppose it's a case of, are we going to see two different types of pricing when this market does come in? For example, here in the UK, where we're no longer part of the European Union, we don't have to follow this legislation. So do we have a different price to what those importers in Europe are paying? It seems unlikely in that case.
But we could.
Yeah. But it's a case of, are we going to see two-tier pricing going forward for this when this legislation comes in, or is the baseline of the market going to lift up to what the kind of expectation is on a EUDR basis? But that's one of those things I think they're still trying to hash out. We're not going to really see the result of that until a market starts trading with the EUDR regulations in place.
Of course. Well, thanks again, Alan. And then lastly, I just wanted to turn to one of our favourite topics of 2025, which has been tariffs. There hasn't been too much in the way of updates lately, but two countries which I did want to concentrate on this month were Brazil and India. Both had some quote-unquote reciprocal tariffs applied to them earlier this year, but they've also had some politically inspired, shall we say, tariffs also put on them as well. So for Brazil, the US applied a total of 50% import tariff on Brazilian goods not too long ago in response to the prosecution of the former president Jair Bolsonaro. And then in India, I believe they had a 25% tariff already, and then that was doubled to 50% as a response from the US for India purchasing Russian oil. So these are quite politically motivated. They're not due to trade surpluses or deficits or anything like that. Realistically, in Brazil, to take an example, Bolsonaro has already been successfully prosecuted. I think it's just a case of sentencing now. So really, it's just a punishment on Brazil for the most part for this 50% tariff. And yet Brazil's the largest exporter of coffee. The US is the largest importer. Surely they're just penalizing, the US is penalizing itself or its consumers anyway, with this situation. So, are we anticipating that these certainly politically motivated tariffs will continue for the foreseeable?
Well, of course, it's really hard to anticipate anything with the Trump administration. They certainly are a gift to us doing these videos. They keep us having plenty of content.
Oh, no doubt.
But it does seem unlikely that if something just that is purely politically motivated and not economically motivated could continue for such a stretch. Given things, like you say, coffee, the US so reliant on imports from Brazil as well this year, because beef stocks and cattle stocks are tighter in the US. Around 27% of imports into the US of this year, or up to around May time, were from Brazil. So that's a significant amount of beef and cattle and commodities coming up into the US. So it does seem unlikely that the US consumer is going to be happy to bear that cost, which is, of course, the ultimate of tariffs, is the consumer always bears the cost. It does seem unlikely that will remain, particularly from the Brazilian side of things. And things are very fast-paced when it comes to tariffs and Trump. I'm not seeing that any economic argument for it to maintain for a long period of time. But again,
it is one of those things where, one phone call with the administration and they're gone the next day.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Nothing would surprise me, I don't think. But it has caused significant volatility. His whole tariffs across all the countries have caused considerable volatility in markets and uncertainty, which is what, particularly looking from my perspective in terms of food retail and consumers, people don't like uncertainty. They want certainty that there's going to be stocks on shelves, etc. 24/7, 365 days a year. And it has been very difficult from that aspect, because people are having to look for different suppliers. And like you say, where else can the US get its coffee if it doesn't buy it from
Such
Brazil?
large volumes, yeah.
It's only really Vietnam. And then, of course, that's taking it a significant amount of freight to get it across to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks, Alad. And I think one thing which is coming up is the U.S. Supreme Court's decision on certainly a number of these tariffs. And is that if the Supreme Court rules against the administration, are we likely to see the status quo of what it was back in as recently as March, or is it a bit more complicated?
It's much more complicated than that. Of course, they can only rule, they could rule against some of these tariffs, but it may not necessarily be, across the board. It could be parts of some tariffs, because the tariffs, of course, are coming at several different phases for several different reasons. And it's likely the reasoning for the tariffs that will likely be challenged, I suppose. So, the reality is we won't know until the Supreme Court deliver their verdict. Of course, the Supreme Court in the US is much more politically motivated than the justice system perhaps over here in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see which way they go on it. But it is very unlikely for us to be able to say that with any certainty that they're going to rule one way or the other, and also where that's going to reset us back to. But
yeah, because we could enter a system where, to stick with India as an example, one of the 25% import tariffs might go away, but another one of the 25% will stay.
No, exactly. And then it's a case of reevaluating the situation again to see where people are going to start procuring their crops and products from, because it will have changed 25% is a significant tariff, as is 50%. But of course, any slight change could change the suppliers and buyers' minds of where they're securing from. So again, the next podcast we probably do, we're probably going to be discussing that one again. So
no doubt. I look forward to it, Alad. And with that, yes, thank you very much for your insights, as always, Alad. And thank you, everyone at home, on the commute, in the office, wherever you are. Thank you very much.